It was December 1979, and a young woman named Rose Harmon shivered in the cold at a bus stop in Madison, Wisconsin. The ground was covered in icy gray slush, and the whipping wind chilled her to the bone. But still, Rose couldn't help feeling cheery. All the lampposts around her were decorated with Christmas lights, and she just loved the way the city looked this time of the year. The 18-year-old high school student shifted her backpack from one shoulder to the other as her bus finally arrived at the stop. When the hydraulic doors opened, Rose stepped on board, and immediately it hit her how much warmer it was inside of the bus than it was outside, to the point where her cheeks flushed and she lowered the hood on her jacket. But as she walked towards the back of the bus, it just felt like the temperature inside the bus was only rising. Rose unbuttoned her parka, but it didn't help. She began sweating, and then suddenly Rose felt so overheated she could barely breathe. The edges of her vision went dark as she tried her best to gulp down air and get her coat off. She could hear people around her reacting to her strange, desperate behavior. Someone was telling the bus driver to pull over, call an ambulance. And then Rose felt a sharp pain in her knees as she collapsed to the floor, and then everything went black. A few hours later, Dr. Russell Chesney made his way to the intensive care unit at the University of Wisconsin Medical Center. Dr. Chesney was a kidney specialist, and any time he was paged to go to the ICU, it was usually bad news. And tonight was no exception. He just received a call from the emergency room letting him know that they were rushing a patient named Rose Harmon up to the ICU for kidney failure. When Dr. Chesney reached Rose's room, he saw a doctor standing at the foot of her bed, scribbling something down on a medical chart, while a nurse rummaged through a black backpack that was sitting on the cabinet along the wall. The doctor at the foot of the bed looked up as Dr. Chesney came inside the room, and the doctor kind of motioned to the unconscious young woman lying right there in the hospital bed with the oxygen mask strapped over her face. Dr. Chesney looked at Rose and felt his chest tighten. He knew Rose was only 18 years old, but in person, she looked even younger. She was far too young to be suffering from kidney failure. Dr. Chesney stepped closer to the bed and noticed that the girl's face and hands were covered in a blotchy pink rash that made it look like she was very badly sunburned. The doctor who had already been in the room told Dr. Chesney that Rose had come into the ER unconscious and with a very high fever. She was barely breathing, and when the doctor performed an initial exam, he heard crackling in her lungs. It was a warning sign that her lungs were filled with fluid, and they needed to perform a procedure to drain them. However, before they could extract the fluid, Rose's kidneys began to fail, and so that was when they had called Dr. Chesney. Dr. Chesney couldn't believe how quickly Rose seemed to be breaking down, and Dr. Chesney had never seen anything like this list of symptoms she had, especially her sunburn-like rash. He knew that Rose's body was in shock, which meant that it wasn't properly able to pump blood to all her organs. That was why her lungs and kidneys were failing. But he had no idea why Rose's body had gone into shock in the first place. And in order to save Rose, that was the question that Dr. Chesney would have to answer. Otherwise, even if he could stabilize her right now, she would eventually go back into shock. Given the rapid onset of Rose's symptoms, Dr. Chesney guessed that she must have contracted a very serious infection. He needed lab work to better understand what was wrong with Rose, but there was no time to wait for test results, which could take up to a couple of days. She needed help right now. A moment later, the nurse returned and told Dr. Chesney that she'd found Rose's ID in her backpack and contacted her parents. Dr. Chesney thanked the nurse and gave her a new task, to start Rose on a few different antibiotics. He hoped that one of them would stop the infection from spreading. And in the meantime, after they used a long needle to drain the fluid from her lungs, he would order as many tests as possible to identify the source of the infection. Dr. Chesney also decided to put Rose on dialysis, meaning a machine would now be flushing toxins from her kidneys, since her own kidneys were not able to do that. They were failing. While the nurses got everything started, Dr. Chesney left to go check on some other patients and promised he would be back soon. An hour later, Dr. Chesney turned back into Rose's room. The sunburn rash had spread up her arms, making her look even worse. He checked her vitals and was dismayed at what he saw. Rose's blood pressure had fallen, which meant that her body was not coming out of shock. So Rose's body still was not pumping enough blood to her organs. Dr. Chesney decided to give the antibiotics one more hour to maybe work. It was nearing the end of his shift, but he wanted Rose to stabilize before he left the hospital. But when Dr. Chesney came back to check on her the next time, he could immediately tell the antibiotics were still not working. The rash had spread even more. Now it fully covered Rose's arms and legs. Her blood pressure was even lower than before. Dr. Chesney was bewildered. The antibiotics should be able to fight off a wide variety of infections, so whatever Rose was fighting had to be extremely rare and very potent. Dr. Chesney clearly could not afford to sit around and wait for Rose's test results to come back, otherwise it would be too late to help her. So he ordered a chest x-ray, thinking maybe it would reveal that she had a bad case of pneumonia. As orderlies wheeled Rose's gurney toward the x-ray suite, a nurse came into the room and told Dr. Chesney that Rose's parents had arrived at the hospital. Dr. Chesney immediately hurried out into the waiting room, meeting the parents right as they stepped off the elevator. Dr. Chesney was anxious to speak with them about Rose's health and felt a pang of empathy at the looks of sheer terror on their faces. Dr. Chesney invited them to sit with him for a moment. He explained that Rose was getting a chest x-ray and they could see her after that. And in the meantime, he asked her parents to walk him through Rose's medical history. Specifically, he wanted to know if she'd been sick at all in the past week, or if anyone around her at home had been sick. But Rose's parents shook their heads, no. The mother assured the doctor that they'd all been feeling fine. They also hadn't received any word of any illnesses circulating at Rose's high school either. And the more they talked about Rose's medical history, the more it became apparent to Dr. Chesney that Rose was a very healthy, average 18-year-old girl. And so Dr. Chesney was stumped. Dr. Chesney didn't have any more questions to ask, so he thanked her parents and promised he'd come get them the moment they could see their daughter. Then he turned on his heels and hurried back down the hallway towards Rose's room, anxious for the results of her x-ray. Thankfully, as soon as Dr. Chesney arrived, Rose's nurse was putting up all the x-rays on a light box so he could look at them. And Dr. Chesney took one look at the x-rays and he gasped. Rose did not have pneumonia, but the reason she was having trouble breathing was very obvious. There was bleeding in her lungs. Dr. Chesney could clearly see that Rose's symptoms were getting more and more dire. But almost worse than that, they seemed kind of random and disconnected. They were not pointing him anywhere. There was one piece of good news, though. When Dr. Chesney checked Rose's vitals, he saw that her blood pressure was rising. This meant the treatments they were doing were finally working, and Rose was coming out of the shock. And so Dr. Chesney decided that Rose was stable enough for her parents to come see her, even if she would not be awake. So he turned out of Rose's room and headed back to the reception area where Rose's parents were waiting patiently, still looking absolutely terrified. He called them over and then led them back into their daughter's room, standing back to give them room by her bedside. He told the parents that in his opinion, Rose would likely regain consciousness as her body stabilized. But what Dr. Chesney did not tell them was that he had no idea why their daughter's lungs were bleeding. He also had no idea why she landed in the hospital in the first place. Her symptoms were just totally confusing. And so Dr. Chesney knew he would need to consult with someone he trusted. So Dr. Chesney said goodnight to Rose's parents and he left the hospital and made his way to the home of a respected colleague. It also happened to be his own home. 20 minutes later, Dr. Chesney's wife, Joan, had just thrown 2 chicken breasts in the oven when she heard keys rattling in the front door, then a familiar sound of footsteps moving through their foyer. Joan turned to greet Dr. Chesney as he walked into the kitchen and threw his car keys on the built-in desk near the fridge. He had a distant look on his face, as though he were lost in thought. Joan frowned. She could tell that her husband was stressed out about something. As she pulled more vegetables from the fridge, she asked him what was wrong. Dr. Chesney sighed and told her all about his new patient, Rose, and her baffling list of symptoms. He was at a total dead end, and he needed his wife's help to figure out what was wrong with her. Joan nodded and put down her knife so she could think. Dr. Chesney's request was not unusual because Joan was also a doctor. The couple frequently bounced ideas off of each other when they had challenging cases. Joan was an infectious disease specialist, and odd cases like this came across her desk all the time. And to Joan, something about Rose's symptoms, the fever, shock, and kidney failure, sounded familiar, but for the life of her, she couldn't remember why. Joan asked more questions about Rose, hoping that something might jog her memory, but she had no luck. She promised her husband she'd keep thinking about it, and then she went back to chopping up the vegetables. Now she was lost in thought as well. When Joan woke up the next morning, Rose was immediately on her mind. In fact, the night before, she had even had a dream about Rose. It felt like the answer to what was going on with Rose was just beyond her fingertips. As Joan got out of bed, she decided she would pay Rose a visit herself that morning. She thought that maybe just seeing Rose in person might help her put the pieces together. An hour later, Joan followed her husband, Dr. Chesney, into Rose's room in the ICU. Joan was shocked as she laid eyes on Rose, who was still unconscious. The sunburned-looking rash now covered Rose's entire body, including the palms of her hands. Joan had never seen a rash like this in her entire career. She thought it looked almost like a chemical burn and wondered aloud if Rose could have been exposed to a chemical that her body absorbed through her skin. Or maybe she took a drug that her parents were not aware of at maybe a high school party or something like that. Dr. Chesney told his wife that the lab results should be ready any moment, and hopefully they would help them find an answer. Dr. Chesney said he'd go check on the test results' progress, and then he stepped out of the room. While Joan waited for him to come back, she decided to check Rose's pupils and her reflexes. So Joan pulled a flashlight from the pocket of her white lab coat and then gently pulled back Rose's eyelids. Joan was surprised to see that Rose's eyes were totally bloodshot. Joan was alarmed. She didn't know of any infections that caused shock and bloodshot eyes like this. She began to wonder if they were witnessing the birth of some new and potentially deadly disease. The prospect was terrifying, and it sent Joan hurrying out of the room and down the hallway to find her husband. Two mornings later, Joan was on her way out of the hospital to attend a local conference on infectious diseases. Rose's test results had finally come back, but they were inconclusive. Thankfully, Rose had finally woken up and was stable for the time being, but Joan and her husband were not any closer to solving her case. Joan hoped that talking to some colleagues at this conference might help her come up with some new ideas. But before she could leave the building, she received a page calling her down to the ER. This was unusual. She wondered why an infectious disease specialist would be needed in the emergency room. But in the pit of her stomach, she feared she already knew the answer, that she was right, that Rose was suffering from some brand new deadly disease, and now it was spreading, and so they might have new patients downstairs. Joan hustled across the hospital, anxiety really starting to settle in. Moments later, she rushed into the ER to find another young woman lying on a gurney covered in a sunburn-like rash who was also struggling to breathe. An ER doctor was helping two nurses wheel the patient into a hospital room. As Joan walked beside them, the doctor told her that the patient was a 15-year-old girl who had collapsed in her kitchen. Like Rose, this new patient had developed her symptoms suddenly, and her parents had rushed her to the hospital right after she'd collapsed. Joan suddenly felt a knot in her stomach. She knew that two young women with the same bizarre symptoms could not be a coincidence. But she didn't have time right now to worry about a potential new epidemic. The patient in front of her was crashing. Joan followed the ER doctor into the patient's room, and as she did, she told the doctor the exact cocktail of IV fluids and dialysis that her husband, Dr. Chesney, had given to Rose. The ER doctor thanked Joan for saving him a call up to the ICU. Joan gave him a grim smile. She knew this treatment she had suggested would likely stabilize this new patient for the time being, but she knew it would not cure her. Joan looked down at her watch and realized she might be late for this conference, and so she needed to leave right now. She needed to attend this conference really for the sake of Rose and this new patient. Joan hoped that one of her colleagues at this conference might recognize the symptoms these two girls were showing and be able to help figure out what was making them sick so they could finally treat them and cure them. An hour later, Joan walked into a large lecture hall, a styrofoam cup of coffee in her hand. The desks had all been arranged in a big circle, and so Joan took a seat on the far side of the room. There were already a few colleagues getting settled, and so Joan waved at a friend as she set her things down and took out her notepad. All morning, specialists took turns presenting cases that involved different infectious diseases. Some had been solved, and others still needed to be diagnosed. They were all interesting, but it was the last case that caught Joan's attention. The speaker handed around copies of a file for one of his current patients. She was a 25-year-old woman, also local to the area, and just like Rose and the 15-year-old girl at the hospital, this patient had also experienced sudden kidney failure, a high fever, and a sunburn-like rash. The presenter broadly described the diagnosis as kidney failure with shock, although they had no idea what had caused her kidneys to fail in the first place. As soon as the presentation was over, Joan hurried over to the last speaker to talk to them about their patient and maybe compare notes. The two doctors looked over the patient's files together, and quickly they saw all three cases were basically identical. The other doctor looked at Joan hopefully and asked if she'd been able to figure out what was making these young women go into shock. Joan just shook her head. She said she was still trying to figure it out, and in fact, that was why she had come over to talk to this doctor, because she was hopeful that they had the answer to what was going on. And so Joan silently ran over the symptoms again in her head, trying to put the pieces together, and then out of nowhere, it just clicked. Suddenly, Joan remembered where she had read about this disease before, in a journal article published a year earlier. That was why, when her husband, Dr. Chesney, had come home and first told her about the symptoms Rose was showing, they seemed so familiar. This article was the reason. Joan quickly thanked her colleague and promised she'd be in touch. Then she hurried out the door and drove back to the Madison Medical Center as fast as she could, and then nearly ran to her office. Once she got there, she began rummaging through the stacks of articles and journals that she'd spent the past 2 days piling up on her desk. Finally, she found the one she'd been looking for. It was in a medical journal called The Lancet. Joan flipped through the pages and found the article that had been published a year earlier. It described the case of an adolescent girl who'd suffered the exact same rashes and other symptoms as Rose and the other two patients. The article described how the girl had contracted a strange new illness caused by a potentially deadly bacteria that entered her body through an open wound. The result, the researchers concluded, was a disease that had never been seen before. Joan tapped her foot, thinking. The symptoms matched, but neither of her patients had any open wounds on their bodies. There was clearly some piece of the puzzle that was still missing. Joan decided to order one more test for both Rose and the 15-year-old girl to see if they were infected with the same bacteria as the girls referenced in this article. In a day or two, she would know whether her current cases and the cases from this article were actually linked. But in the meantime, she knew that if there were already 3 cases of this potential bacterial illness, there would be more. And so she decided it was now time to call the Wisconsin Department of Public Health and tell them they had a potentially very big problem on their hands. The next afternoon, Joan was sitting in her office catching up on paperwork when a tall man wearing a nice suit knocked on her doorframe. He looked anxious and out of breath as he introduced himself as Dr. Jeff Davis, an investigator with the State Department of Health. He'd spent the entire morning interviewing family members of the 3 women affected by this mystery disease. Joan stood up immediately and thanked him and said, "Please come in and sit down," but Dr. Davis just shook his head and said he couldn't stay. He just wanted Joan to know that he did find a link between the 3 cases. Dr. Davis explained that the 3 patients had almost nothing in common. They didn't eat the same things, they didn't go to the same places, or live similar lifestyles. The only thing they shared was the fact that they were all young women. And so he thought that they could have something in common biologically, and he'd wondered if maybe they had all been menstruating at the time they got sick. So he checked their charts and learned that yes, all 3 were having their period when their symptoms developed. Also, Rose, who was now able to speak, would tell Dr. Davis that she actually remembered getting a similar-looking rash on her body the month before when she had her period the last time. This was a promising link, but Dr. Davis said he didn't know what it meant, or if it was even relevant at all. After he was done speaking, Dr. Davis just looked at Joan expectantly, as though she could now solve the mystery. But Joan wasn't sure what to say. It didn't make sense. There was nothing about a period that would make these women so sick. But Joan knew that this connection was really all they had to go on, so she couldn't just dismiss the theory outright. And so instead, she took a seat and picked up Dr. Davis's notes from all the family meetings he had just had, and she began to read over them. The next morning, Joan stepped into her office to find the lab results sitting on her desk. She felt a rush of energy as she grabbed them and began scanning the documents in her hand. It would turn out both of her patients, Rose and the 15-year-old girl, had tested positive for a life-threatening infection from bacteria called Staphylococcus aureus. This was the same bacteria that infected the girls in the Lancet article Joan had read, which meant Rose and the 15-year-old girl had the new syndrome outlined in the article, which the researchers named toxic shock syndrome. Joan breathed a small sigh of relief. At least she knew what she was treating now. She hoped that with enough specialized care, both of her patients lying in the ICU would make a full recovery. But Joan still had a very big problem. She still didn't know how her patients could have contracted the deadly staph infection in the first place. They had no open wounds, no place for the bacteria to enter the bloodstream. She remembered Dr. Davis's observation that all the women were on their periods at the time. Joan wondered if Rose and the 15-year-old girl had taken a contaminated painkiller to alleviate their cramps, and maybe that's why they got sick. But this was only a theory, and until doctors figured it out, more people would likely get sick. Joan hoped Dr. Davis and the other investigators at the Department of Health would be able to find the cause quickly. About 6 weeks later, on a cold morning in late February 1980, an epidemiologist at the National Centers for Disease Control named Bruce Dan drove to work, feeling completely at a loss. He had spent almost 2 months trying to find the cause of the toxic shock infections in Madison, Wisconsin, and other locations all over the United States. To date, no one could figure out what was causing the illness or how to stop what was now a nationwide epidemic. By now, the mysterious infections had become national news. And as Dr. Dan pulled into the parking lot at the CDC, a story about toxic shock came on the radio. He listened as the reporter summarized the stats that Dr. Dan had already memorized. Since early December, 107 cases of toxic shock had surfaced in 33 states around the country. Thankfully, no deaths have been reported yet. Dr. Dan switched off the radio, parked his car, and walked to his office in silence. As he said good morning to his secretary handed him a stack of memos. This had become routine, because ever since the newspapers, TV, and radio started publishing daily reports on toxic shock, Dr. Dan had received hundreds of calls from women all across the country experiencing similar symptoms. Dr. Dan thanked the secretary and was about to leave when she stopped him and she handed him one more memo. He looked down at it, and as he read it, his stomach dropped. That morning, a young woman living in Wisconsin had become the first person to die from this mysterious infection. This woman was not one of Joan's patients, so she was not Rose or the 15-year-old girl, and in fact, by this point, Rose and the 15-year-old girl had actually fully recovered and were back with their families. But now it was clear to Dr. Dan that this infection could turn deadly, and Dr. Dan had been too late to stop it. He walked into his office so upset he wanted to kick his desk chair. He had always been very motivated to solve this mystery, but now his motivation was through the roof. He decided it was time for drastic action. He would find the answer to this riddle no matter the cost. Over the next few weeks, Dr. Dan and his team made thousands of phone calls interviewing women who were being treated for toxic shock. They also talked to young women who were not getting sick for comparison. At the end of each day, Dr. Dan would spend hours in his office reading the notes taken during each of these calls, searching for anything that stood out. Meanwhile, the number of toxic shock cases mounted. Within a month, more than 100 serious cases had been reported, and this only motivated Dr. Dan to work harder and stay later, losing himself in his notes. And finally, after 4 weeks of hard work, Dr. Dan found a link. He discovered that all the women who developed toxic shock syndrome used tampons when they menstruated, not pads. Dr. Dan sat at his desk, scratching his chin. He knew he was onto something. Granted, tampons had been on the market for more than 50 years. In fact, 50 million women used them every month in the United States alone. Out of that 50 million, only several hundred had gotten sick. So clearly, the vast majority of tampons were causing no problem at all. Dr. Dan rapped his pen on the desk thinking, and he wondered maybe it was just one brand of tampons that had somehow become contaminated in some way. And so he decided to begin calling tampon manufacturers, and what he found would finally solve the mystery. As Dr. Dan and his colleagues conducted their surveys, they discovered that in about 70% of the toxic shock cases, the women used tampons from a brand called Rely. Specifically, they used the heavily absorbent version. At first, this didn't make sense to Dr. Dan. Rely had introduced the heavily absorbent tampons 6 years earlier, in 1974, but there was no evidence linking them to toxic shock until this outbreak had started in late 1979. However, right before the outbreak began, Rely began using synthetic materials. And the other brands, which accounted for the other 30% of toxic shock cases, also were using synthetic materials, just not as much. It turned out that while these materials allowed for much better absorbency, they also helped promote the growth of the bacteria that causes toxic shock. Once Dr. Dan discovered the link between Rely tampons and toxic shock, the CDC published an article with their findings. For Dr. Joan Chesney and her husband Russell, the study was a huge relief. Thankfully, all their patients had fought off the deadly infection, and now that the word was out, they were hopeful the outbreak would taper off. After some initial resistance, Rely superabsorbent tampons were finally pulled from the shelves in September of 1980. By that point, 772 women had developed toxic shock syndrome from using tampons, and the majority of them used Rely tampons. Tragically, 38 of those women died. Their deaths inspired new industry regulations to reduce the absorbency of tampons and also to print mandatory warning labels on the boxes. And since then, toxic shock syndrome has become incredibly rare, with only a handful of deaths every year. 12, 2016, 18-year-old Dylan Parker was attending a party in his hometown of Osborne, Idaho. Towards the end of the night, Dylan decided he wanted to leave the party, but it was snowing and cold outside, so he called his mom and he asked her if she would come pick him up at the gas station just down the road from the house he was at. His mother would say it was obvious Dylan had been drinking because he was slurring his words, but at the time, even though she was upset about it because he was underage, she thought, you know what, it's cold, it's snowing, I just want to get my kid home safe and we'll deal with this tomorrow. So she agreed to pick him up. She hopped in the car and began driving to this gas station, and as she's driving, she gets another call from her son. This time, he sounds totally panicked and scared, and he's asking his mom, you know, where are you? Where are you, Mom? And she's telling him, I'm going to be there in a minute. I'm just down the road. Calm down. I'll be there in a minute. And then he hung up. When she got to the gas station, he wasn't there. When she tried calling him back, his phone was off. She got out of the car and went into the gas station and asked if they'd seen her son, and they said they hadn't. She got back in the car and she drove around for about 30 minutes yelling for her son, but there was no sign of him. She still couldn't get in touch with him. His phone was still off, and she just had this bad feeling that something had happened to him, so she called the police. The police conducted a thorough search that started with the house Dylan had been at for this party. They interviewed the people who were there, and everybody said Dylan seemed fine, and he just left. He said he was getting picked up by his mom. But as they looked around town, they just could not find any sign of him. 10 days later, Dylan's body was found in an area nobody was searching. In fact, he was found by accident by two people that crashed their ATVs in the middle of the night and then went back in the daytime the next day to retrieve their ATVs, and that's when they found Dylan's body. He was located outside of town, high up a hill in a dense forest, which in order to get there, he would have had to walk the opposite direction of the gas station. Now, toxicology reports showed Dylan had been under the influence of alcohol, but this was his hometown. He certainly knew where the gas station was, and he would have known he was walking in the complete wrong direction, especially when you consider walking towards the gas station was like walking towards the center of town. There was lots of lights, lots of indication you're going in the right direction. To walk in the other direction towards that hill where he was found would have been like walking towards darkness, where there's no lights, there's no sign of town. It's obviously the wrong direction. But the case gets even stranger because on the day Dylan went missing, there was a lot of snow on the ground, which meant people would have made tracks. And from the time Dylan went missing until he was found, it didn't snow, and the temperature did not heat up enough to melt the snow. So in theory, any tracks Dylan would have made, they would still be there when he was found. But where Dylan was found, there were no tracks anywhere near him. No footprints, no tire tracks, nothing. It was as if someone had dropped him out of the sky. Another strange element of this case is Dylan was found without pants and without boots on. And so you would think for him to make it all the way up to this spot on the hillside through kind of rough, rocky, snowy terrain through a forest, that you would expect his socks to be totally ruined and his feet to potentially be cut up. But his socks were clean and his feet were uninjured. This led investigators to believe Dylan must have somehow made his way to that spot on the hillside in that forest without leaving any tracks. And then once he was there, he removed his pants and his boots. Except dozens of police officers and sniffer dogs were never able to find those pants and boots, despite the fact they should, in theory, be in that immediate area where he took them off. While he determined Dylan's cause of death to be hypothermia, the deputy coroner, David Roos, was convinced there was something off about this case. After local authorities came out and said Dylan's death was an accident, David became very vocal in the media saying he disagreed and he thought Dylan had been attacked. But the county never reinvestigated Dylan's case, and in fact, they went on to fire David Roos, the coroner, saying he was no longer qualified to do the job. David says they fired him to keep him quiet. As a result, we may never know the truth about what happened to Dylan. Dustin Self was born and raised in Piedmont, Oklahoma, which is a small community just northwest of Oklahoma City. Growing up, Dustin had always been kind of a mediocre performer with so-so grades, didn't take things too seriously, but in his senior year, he discovered weightlifting, and it seemed to give his life a much-needed sense of purpose, and it really kind of helped him organize all aspects of his life. So by the time he was graduating, he was not only in great physical shape, he had also managed to raise all of his grades up significantly, and he seemed to be on a path to success. But interestingly, after high school, he didn't pursue higher education, he didn't go get a job, he didn't try to spend more time with friends and family. Instead, he decided he wanted to go live in the wild. His family believed this was due to his obsession with the Hollywood film Into the Wild, which is about the true story of Christopher McCandless, who gives up a promising career to go live off in the wilds of Alaska. Christopher would ultimately die in the wilds of Alaska after eating a poisonous plant, or some say he died from starvation. So about a year after Dustin's high school graduation, he was 19 years old, it was March of 2013, and he finally felt like he was ready to go live out this dream of living in the wild. And so he told his family he was gonna go on this cross-country road trip, stopping at different points along the way, living out in the woods. His family knew he was really fixated on this and couldn't talk him out of it, and so they ultimately accepted it and said, just be really careful. So in early March, Dustin heads out on this road trip, and nobody hears from him until March 15th, when he calls his parents and says, I'm in this tiny town called Fields, Oregon, and I'm at a gas station. Everything's going great, nothing to worry about. The very next day, Dustin called his ex-girlfriend and told her he was lost on a mountain. And his ex-girlfriend said she couldn't really understand what he was saying, and she was actually at the airport about to board a plane, so it was noisy, and she stepped into a bathroom to hear him more clearly, but even as she's hearing him, what he was saying just wasn't making any sense. He was talking about this mountain he was lost on, and he was referencing that there were people that were after him, and it was just very confusing. And before she could get any more clarifying information from Dustin, he hung up, and then she couldn't get back in touch with him. So she calls Dustin's father, and she tells him that she had this really weird conversation with Dustin, where he said he's lost on this mountain, and even though I didn't really understand what he was telling me, he sounded really, really scared. Dustin's father thanked her, and then spent the rest of the day trying to get in touch with his son, but every time he called, it just went straight to voicemail. The next day, when he still hadn't heard from his son, he called the police. The police did not have a great idea of where to start looking for him because Dustin did not specify to his ex-girlfriend what mountain he was actually lost on. All they had was his last known location, which was that gas station in Fields, Oregon. So they went to that gas station and he wasn't there, and they asked the people that worked there if they remembered Dustin, and they didn't, and no one knew anything about him. And so after that, they just had to wait for more leads to come in because they couldn't just, search all the mountains in Oregon for Dustin. They would never find him. A month later, after no one's heard from Dustin, a ranch hand who was living in a very rural section of Oregon, not far from the gas station in Fields, Oregon, discovered Dustin's truck parked precariously on the edge of this road inside of a canyon. It was abandoned, but inside were Dustin's GPS, some food, and some energy drinks. His backpack that contained his sleeping bag and his tent were missing. There was a comprehensive search done around where the truck had been found, but after a couple of days, nothing had been found and the search was terminated. The area around where Dustin's truck was found was very hilly and rocky, but there weren't that many trees, which meant if you were standing on one of the different mountains in the area, you'd be able to very easily look out and actually see a road. And so the searchers were thinking to themselves, how could this guy have gotten lost on any of these mountains? Because all he'd have to do is look over there and there's a road and therefore there's help. 6 months later, a hunter was up in those mountains near where Dustin's truck was found, and he was actually moving through one of these small sections of aspen trees. And as he was walking through, he thought he saw a deer, and he was kind of stalking through these trees. And he gets to an opening where he looks down and he stops, because underneath the bush is an obviously dead man, not wearing any clothes, who's on his hands and knees, and it looks like his head is stuck in the ground. When the hunter walks over to get a better look, it looks like this guy must have pushed his head into a hole in the ground before he succumbed to whatever killed him. The hunter leaves and tells police. Police show up, they search the area, and they find a jacket nearby, inside of which is a wallet that contains Dustin's ID cards, as well as Dustin's car keys. The body was Dustin's. Dustin was located 9 miles away from where his truck had been parked on that road, and nowhere in the area did they find a campsite. They actually never found his backpack that contained the tent or the sleeping bag, so they think he never set up camp, but they don't know where his supplies went. After Dustin's family found out what happened to him, his father would say, I just don't understand why he didn't seek shelter in his vehicle. It was parked on the road, he wasn't that far away. Heck, he could have run those 9 miles. He was in great physical shape, and in theory, he would have known where he parked it, or if he didn't, he could have just walked to the edge of the mountain and looked out and seen the road it was parked on. So the family just couldn't understand his decision making. Investigators would say there was no indication Dustin was trying to hurt himself and foul play was ruled out. So what was it that caused Dustin to abandon his car and walk 9 miles uphill and ditch his clothes and ditch his backpack that contained his tent and his sleeping bag and then stick his head in a hole until he died? The only thing that could be determined was that Dustin probably died of hypothermia, but because of the state his body was in from decomposition, the coroner said we don't know for sure. So like all the other missing 411 cases, we're left with lots of questions and not a lot of answers. In 2010, Jan Maccabee was living with her husband Bruce in a town called Lima, Ohio, which is approximately 80 miles southwest of Lake Erie. While Jan had built a successful career as a booking agent for musicians, bands, and entertainers, her real passion was deer hunting. So on September 29th of that year, right after deer hunting season had opened in Ohio, Jan decided to go out on a hunt. That morning had been cold and damp and gray, but by that afternoon, when Jan was getting ready to go, the temperatures had risen and the sun had come out. Jan's preferred method of hunting was to sit and watch from a tree stand, which is a ladder that you put in the woods that sits about 15 feet high. She would sit up there with her bow and arrow and wait to take a shot when a deer came by. Around 5 p.m. that day, she told Bruce she was leaving, and she made it to her tree stand by about 5:30. The forest she was going to be hunting in was one she was very familiar with, and it was not very remote. There were a couple houses just outside the woods, there were some agricultural areas, and her nephew actually went to high school just a mile north of these woods. But from the tree stand where she was sitting, all she could see around her was trees. Shortly after Jan sat down, she started texting with one of her friends on her BlackBerry, and periodically she'd poke her head up and look for deer. There weren't any, and then she'd go back to texting. The whole time this is happening, Jan can hear birds and crickets and squirrels and all the sounds of the forest all around her. A little after 6 p.m., her texting conversation with her friend reached a natural conclusion, and so she went back to just kind of sitting in the tree stand looking around. By about 6:20 p.m., she still hadn't seen any deer, and she was starting to get bored, so she decided she would take a selfie. She picked up her BlackBerry, she took the selfie, and as soon as she was done, she became aware that the forest had suddenly gone completely quiet. No more squirrels, no more birds, no more crickets, just complete silence. And she knew as a hunter, the only time this happened was when a large predator was in the area and all the other animals went quiet. But Jan would later say there was just something different about this silence. It was so sudden and so complete that it scared her. And she wound up sending another text message to that friend she'd been texting earlier that said, the woods just went completely silent. Very odd. As soon as Jan hit send on that text message and lowered her phone, she immediately became aware of something about 20 feet away in the tree that was right across from her. And she said it was the most unusual and terrifying thing she had ever seen. Moving left to right through the branches was this thing that she described as like a visual distortion. She said it was like looking across pavement on a really hot day and seeing that mirage, except this one looked like it was alive, like it had mass, like it was a a see-through person that had been wrapped in Saran Wrap. And so Jan thinks it's a floater in her eyes, and so she rubs her eyes, and when she looks up, this thing has now moved down a branch closer to her and has stopped, like it's perched on the branch, staring at her, and Jan's horrified, but she knows she wants to document it, so she grabs her phone and she raises it up and she takes a picture on her BlackBerry right as this thing kind of disappears behind the tree and vanishes. Just seconds after this thing disappeared, all the sounds in the forest came back. The birds, the squirrels, the crickets, it was all back to normal, but Jan was really shaken up because she just could not make sense of what she just saw. So she just continued to stare in the general direction of where this thing was for several minutes until finally she felt like it was safe again, at which point she brought her phone up to look at the picture she had taken. When she looked at it, it looked like a blurry mess, and so she thought, oh, I blew it, I put my hand over it, or my hair got in the way of it, or something. But at the same time, she's thinking to herself, but my hair didn't get in the way of it, and I very clearly held it out in front of me and know that I was looking at my phone when I took it, and I had a clear shot of this thing, so I don't really understand how this photo got so messed up. But after looking at the picture for a little while, she started to kind of laugh at herself, the idea that she'd just seen a Saran Wrap person running through the treetops. She just felt like that didn't happen. It must have been in my head, and as for this picture, I probably just blocked the lens, and that's it. That night, when Jan got back to her house, she did not tell her husband Bruce about what happened to her in the tree stand because, again, she's telling herself it was all in her head. They have dinner, they clean up, they sit down in the living room, and they're both on their phones, and they're just kind of scrolling through the internet and their emails. And at some point, Bruce reacts to something he's reading. He makes a sound. And Jan hears him and says, oh, what are you looking at? And he said, I just got a really interesting email from our nephew, the one that goes to school down the road. He said that today they were outside for band practice, and at some point, all of them turned to look at the forest, and there was a bright circular light that was kind of hovering in the forest. And I guess they all stared at it for about 5 or 10 seconds. And then at some point, the light kind of went back into the forest and they didn't know what to make of it. And I guess one of his classmates said that a year before, the exact same thing happened. And it apparently scared their instructor so badly that they canceled rehearsal and went inside because of it. As Jan is listening to her husband read this email, she's sitting up and her heart is racing. And as soon as he finishes, she says, what time did he say that happened? Bruce picked up how intensely she was asking him. And so he looked at the email, looked back at his wife, and was like, it was between 7:50 and 8. Why? At this point, Jan revealed everything that had happened to her while she was hunting, seeing that visual distortion in the trees that looked like a figure of some kind. And she would tell him that the forest she was in was the same one their nephew was claiming to have seen this circular light floating inside of. She told him she tried to take a picture of the thing she saw, but the picture didn't come out. But her husband, who is an optical physicist and therefore an expert at analyzing a picture, said, here, let me take a look at it. As soon as he looked at the image, the first thing he asked her was, well, did your hair get in front of the lens? And she said, no, I was holding it about a foot away from my head and my hair was in a ponytail and a ball cap, so that can't be my hair. And so he looked at it again and he asked her, well, did you put your finger over the lens maybe? And she said, yeah, I might have. I don't think I did, but it's certainly possible. And so not really thinking much of this picture, he decides before giving the phone back to just check the resolution of the image, because whenever he would examine a picture, that was something he would do, and he discovered an anomaly. It turns out Jan's BlackBerry was only capable of taking pictures in 3 distinct resolutions. Basically, the size of the image could only come in small, medium, or large. And this picture she had taken of this thing she saw in the trees was a resolution size that was not small, medium, or large. It was some random size that the phone was actually not capable of producing. And so he asked his wife, did you manipulate your resolution settings? And she said, no, I don't even know how to do that. So Bruce looked at the other couple of pictures she had taken that day, and all of those fell into the small, medium, or large resolution size. It was just this one picture that was a total anomaly. And so Bruce was suddenly really intrigued by this image and by his wife's story. And so he continued to study the image, and he kept asking his wife questions about, how she was positioned in the tree stand and where the sun was and how far away this thing was and everything about the whole layout. And eventually Bruce started conducting experiments to see if he could duplicate this image his wife had created. And he got pretty scientific about it, and he could not duplicate it. Ultimately, because Bruce trusts his wife did not alter the photo in any way, and he trusts his wife as being truthful about what she experienced in the tree stand, what she saw, and based on his years of being an optical physicist, Bruce believes whatever was in the trees distorted this image. That even if she had put her finger over the lens, which he doesn't think she did, and she doesn't think she did, the picture resolution was altered in such a way that something had to have an effect on it. There was a third-party effect on this picture. If you're interested in reading all of Bruce's scientific findings about this picture, I have included his write-up that he posted online in the sources below.